arrival at Manila Airport. Who killed him and why? Philippine President Marcos says the communists did it. Opposition leaders blame Marcos. And the United States would like some questions answered before President Reagan visits the Philippines in November. We'll talk tonight with Aquino's widow, with his brother-in-law, ABC News correspondent Ken Kashiwahara, who accompanied Aquino to Manila, with a former top State Department official who knew Aquino and knows Marcos well, and with the Philippine opposition leader living in exile.
Who's Nightline?
Aquino and Ferdinand Marcos. And though President Marcos denies any complicity in the assassination of opposition leader Aquino, Marcos's rule may never be the same. In fact, Aquino's murder could hasten its end. For Aquino's murder at the Manila airport yesterday was no isolated crime of passion, but an act calculated to affect the political life and structure of the Philippines. Aquino had been living in the United States for the past 3 years, but he decided to go home, even though President Marcos warned him not to come, even though friends warned him he faced death. He left his wife and 5 children in Newton, Massachusetts, and his wife Corazon and 12-year-old daughter Christina are with us now from our bureau in Boston. Mrs. Aquino, your husband's friends warned him that he faced grave danger if he went home. Did he discuss that with you, and what did the two of you say about it?
Well, I think my husband being in political life, I think the two of us were always aware, of the dangers involved. And having gone through a detention of 7.5 years, and my husband had, gone on a hunger strike in 1975. And at that time, he told me that he had surrendered himself to the Lord. And he told me after 1975, all the years will be bonus years, and we should be grateful for them.
So when he left on August 13th and said goodbye to you, the two of you understood that he might face grave danger, imprisonment, and even death.
Well, we thought imprisonment would be it. I myself believed, that would be the worst thing we could expect. We were hoping for a house arrest, but it seemed to us that maybe he would be put back in the detention center. Never did I think, that this would happen.
Now, President Marcos warned him not to come, said he would not be admitted to the country, and in fact said the reason was an assassination plot against your husband had been uncovered. What did your husband say about that?
Well, as early as July 19, after my husband had filed an application for a travel document to return home, he was told by the Philippine Consulate General that he should not return home because the government had uncovered assassination plots against him. Because of this, my husband sent a telegram to President Marcos asking him that he, reverse the order of the Consul General and allow him to return home. My husband said that all he wanted to do was return home to effect a national reconciliation, and that he had a clear conscience and he was not afraid of any possible assassination plots.
Did he ever get a reply from President Marcos?
It was not President Marcos, but the Defense Minister, Juan Ponce Enrile, who sent my husband a telegram. And we received this on August 2nd, and the telegram said for my husband to delay his arrival in Manila by 30 days at least, so that they could neutralize the alleged assassins.
All right, with all of this as the background, Mrs. Aquino, why did your husband go home?
Well, my husband felt that while he was strong and healthy, and while he believed Marcos was still in good health, that he could ask President Marcos to please talk to him, and he wanted to plead with Mr. Marcos to restore the democratic processes in our country. My husband believed that only Marcos, with his authority and power, could do so. So it was so imperative that he go home while it was still possible for the two of them to talk.
Well, why did he think he would have any influence over President Marcos? Mr. Marcos hated your husband, and your husband certainly disliked the president.
Well, my husband felt that here he was living, in Boston for the past 3 years, living in a free country, and yet willing to give all this up and risk another jail term. He thought that would prove his sincerity to the president. And he felt if the two of them could communicate directly with each other, since they both love the Philippines, then maybe the two of them could work out something to restore democracy to our country.
Mrs. Aquino, who do you think murdered your husband?
I would not like to say anything definite now. I would like to return home and talk to the people there. I have just seen the television shots. Let me just say this. I thought that the security given my husband was really inadequate. There were only 3 soldiers whom I saw on television as coming up the plane to take my husband. When we were still in the Philippines and when my husband was in the detention center, whenever he would go to, either the Supreme Court or the military tribunal, there would be at least 20 to 30 security men, guarding him and really looking out for his security. So this really was quite a strange thing to see happen. Only 3 people going up there to take him.
Well, now, the government says your husband was murdered by someone who had slipped in and put on the uniform of an airport worker and had come very close with a single pistol. You saw the television pictures of that man lying there. Does that seem probable?
Let me say this. My relatives told me that it was very difficult to get to the airport. You had to get tickets, and even where they were, they were still so very far away from where the airplane was. It just doesn't seem possible. I don't know how that assassin could have possibly gotten to where he was, if he were just alone.
Mrs. Aquino, I want to talk to you a little bit more and also to your daughter, Christina, and we'll do that if you'll just please stand by when we return in just a moment.
All right.
Politics aside for a moment, tell us about your husband. You were married, what, 28 years ago? What kind of a man was he?
Well, for me, he was the best possible. He was the best possible man for me. I have never met any other man that I would have wanted to have as a husband and to have lived with all of these 28 years.
A lot of people said he was flamboyant, was he?
Well, maybe he was, but to me, he was my ideal man. And he made me happy. And not only that, if I am a better person today, I think I owe that to my husband.
Your daughter, Christina, is there with you, is she not?
Yes, she is.
Christina, what kind of a dad was Benigno Aquino?
My dad was caring, and he may not have been there with us for that much, but the time we spent together really means a lot to me and to my family.
Well, a lot of busy people aren't there all the time. Were you aware of the type of work he was doing? What did you think of that work?
Yes, I was aware of the work he was doing, and I felt proud of him that he was able to do that.
Do you know the difference between terms such as freedom, despotism, tyranny, and freedom?
I know freedom and tyranny. I don't know that despotism or whatever, but...
What did your father say to you about freedom and tyranny and the difference?
Freedom was something that we should cherish, and he never really talked about tyranny all that much to me, but freedom, we were able to have it here.
You know he was in jail for a long time in the Philippines?
Yes, and I was only 2 years old when he was put in jail.
And then he came to the United States. He had open heart surgery, and that made him well, and he went to Massachusetts, and he taught. What about those years, the last 3 years?
They were very happy times for all of us, and it was a time that I really got to know my father, and it was also a time that we were happy.
Did the two of you talk just before he left a few days ago to go back to Manila?
Well, he called us from Taipei, and he just told me that to hurry home because the prison where he was lonely and sad.
Christina, what are you going to do with your life? Do you know yet?
No, I don't, and I somehow want to be a lawyer, but I'm not really sure of that right now.
Do you think you would want to go back to the Philippines, live in the United States, or some other country?
I loved it here in the United States, but I know now that the Philippines is my country. It's the country where we should live.
Mrs. Aquino, you and your family are going back to the Philippines tomorrow. I think you take a plane early in the morning.
Yes, that's right.
You've talked to your friends and relatives there. What do they tell you about the atmosphere? What are you going to find? Do you know?
Well, this morning I got a call from my sister, and you see, my husband was lying in state in our home, and she told me that if it were all right with me, they would like to transfer him to a bigger place, maybe one of the churches in our neighborhood. You see, there have been so many people coming to see my husband. They counted something like 1,500 people per hour. And the people had said that they had waited in line for something close to 4 hours.
What do you think of that?
Well, I am just very grateful for all these people. And I hope this means that my husband did not die in vain.
Mrs. Aquino, do you fear that you may be in danger if you return to the Philippines?
I don't think so. And I do not worry about those things. I feel that my place should be in the Philippines now, and I am eager to be home to see my husband and to arrange for the funeral.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Mrs. Aquino, Christina, for being with us tonight from Boston.
Thank you.
When we return, we'll look at reaction in the Philippines the day after Aquino's assassination. We'll also have a report on what the death of Aquino will mean to U.S.-Philippine relations. Will the killing prompt President Reagan to cancel his planned trip to the Philippines? As well as a report on how Aquino spent his 3 years of exile in the United States. Aquino. Authorities said the alleged assassin was shot and killed by security guards at the airport. Funeral services for Aquino are scheduled to be held in Manila next Sunday. Jim Laurie, who was aboard the plane that flew Aquino from Taiwan to Manila yesterday, reports from Manila on reaction to his death.
A day after the shooting, thousands of people filed through the home of Aquino. The family ordered the coffin left open, his wounds and blood-stained clothing unaltered. But by and large, most Filipinos did not demonstrate great emotion over the death of Aquino. Since 1972, he had been a distant figure, either in jail or in exile in America. But among the opposition in the Philippines, there was anger and bitterness. They had lost a leader. And Aquino supporter Salvador Laurel complained there were too many unanswered questions about the shooting. First, there was still confusion over exactly how the shooting happened. The conflicts between accounts of the shooting will probably never be resolved. But the larger question concerns the motives of the assassin and those who may have supported him, and what all this may mean for the future of the Philippines. Worried about just those questions, the Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos, Aquino's strongest foe, went on television, flanked by his wife and his entire cabinet. Marcos said that no one regretted the shooting more than he did. The answer to who stood to gain the most from killing Aquino may lie with Aquino himself. In several interviews in the hours before his death, Aquino said he expected an attempt on his life.
As long as I'm 10,000 miles away,
Jim Laurie for Nightline in Manila.
That correspondent Laurie report was transmitted to the United States several hours ago. We promised you at the beginning of this broadcast that we would have an interview with Ken Kashiwahara, ABC News correspondent who was Aquino's brother-in-law and who accompanied Aquino to Manila. But we're unable to do that. The television facility in Manila, which is controlled by the Philippine government, will not allow us permission to transmit that interview with Kashiwahara. Aquino, who had been living in the United States for the past 3 years, was considered President Marcos's strongest political rival, either inside or outside the Philippines. Nightline correspondent Betsy Aaron has a report on his political career.
Benigno Aquino in 1980, living in self-imposed exile in the United States, studying and working at Harvard University and then at MIT. A man who felt the time was not right to go home. A man whose battle against Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos consumed his whole life, a battle in which he'd lose his life.
The battle has been joined, and the time has come for all Filipinos to take sides. Either you are for the cause of freedom or the curse of tyranny.
Aquino had been the youngest senator ever elected in the Philippines. He was young, charismatic, he'd married well, and he even described himself as a radical rich guy. By 1966, he'd become Secretary General of the Liberal Party and Ferdinand Marcos' principal political enemy. There would be elections in 1973 when President Marcos would be barred from seeking a third term. Senator Aquino looked like a likely presidential candidate, but Marcos was not about to let that happen. In September of 1972, Marcos declared martial law. Mr. Aquino was arrested, charged with murder, illegal possession of firearms, and subversion. His trial went on for 4 years. 4 years in which Aquino attacked his enemy, Marcos, from the witness stand. He was finally sentenced to death in November of 1977, but that didn't stop him. From behind bars, over television, Aquino talked to his public, running for office during the first elections to be held under martial law. He lost, as did all 21 of the opposition candidates. In May of 1980, President Marcos commuted Aquino's death sentence, allowing him to leave for the United States to undergo heart surgery. He never went back, although he spent his time planning to return, always in contact with members of the Marcos opposition. In October of 1980, Ted Koppel talked to Aquino on this program.
Now, apparently it is true that you are facing a possible death penalty in the Philippines. Under what circumstances would you go back then?
I will go back because I think I'm innocent. And if Mr. Marcos would like to shoot me on that basis, so be it.
Do you recommend the use of violence to topple the Marcos government?
No, sir. I believe that violence is the worst course that we can take because it will only spawn more violence. You will create a vicious cycle.
And yet, Mr. Aquino, when a man of your stature predicts that violence will erupt, that terrorism will erupt, isn't that almost tantamount to recommending it?
No, sir, I did not recommend violence, although I warned Mr. Marcos that if he does not lift his martial rule, which is the original institutional violence in my country, that is the original violence, so that these subsequent bombings are only the effect of the original cause. So that when Mr. Marcos increased his repression, he will only be increasing violence. The only way you can remove violence is to remove the original cause, which is martial rule.
Is there ever anything that justifies political terrorism?
No, sir, I do not believe that political terrorism can be justified. But then again, I do say that sometimes there's a need for violence to liberate yourself from it.
In February of 1981, President Marcos appeared on Nightline.
Now, we are not against any political opposition. In fact, we encourage it. I have said so openly, and I say so again. We encourage a strong opposition in the parliament, which was elected in 1978, and which is acting right now, legislating for the government.
President Marcos, as you know, sir, a few months ago, we had one of your former political opponents, former Senator Benigno Aquino, here on this broadcast. He claims that he cannot come back to the Philippines for fear that he will not only be jailed, but perhaps executed.
He was convicted for murder, for sedition, or rebellion, or subversion. He appealed his case to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court threw out his case. So now there is a warrant of arrest against him. He is also facing participation in the bombing incident that killed Americans. Now, that is a matter that he has to face up to. He claims that he has nothing whatsoever to do with it, and yet there are two witnesses. One of them is an American, Victor Lovely, who says that it was Aquino who directed the bombing which resulted in the killing of these Americans. That's a matter which is now subject to the scrutiny of the judiciary of our government. And it's not something which any foreign government like the American government should intervene in. I think we should allow the judiciary in our country to determine whether he's guilty or not. Now, if he says that he wants to come back here, sure, by all means, he can come back. But for what? He has to face up to the facts of life. If he wants an amnesty, we will consider it. If he wants a conditional pardon, we will also consider it. He is not that important. It's only the Western press that is making him important. I don't know why. There are other brighter young people in the opposition who should be developed.
Just a year ago, last August, President Marcos told his people he'd uncovered a plan for a nationwide strike to be accompanied by his assassination and bombings. Then, without benefit of martial law, but by presidential order, dozens of labor union members were arrested. There was a crackdown on what he called street crime. Suspected criminals were shot on sight. And then President Marcos declared that law and order had been restored. There is opposition to Ferdinand Marcos, and the obvious man to lead it, Benigno Aquino, until yesterday. Parliamentary elections were scheduled for next May. Aquino was finally going home to rally the opposition. Just 1 hour before his plane landed in Manila, he talked about his possible death with reporters. Assassinations serve a purpose, he said. I have to suffer with my people. Betsy Aaron for Nightline in New York.
Coming up next, a report on U.S. reaction to Aquino's death. The U.S. government is closely watching the investigation into the murder of opposition leader Aquino. State Department correspondent Ann Garrels has a report on U.S. reaction to the assassination and its potential impact on U.S.-Philippine relations.
The White House has said it trusts that President Marcos will swiftly and vigorously track down the perpetrators of the assassination. The State Department has added that
we expect their investigation to be as objective and thorough as possible.
But for all this apparent confidence, the Aquino assassination highlights the fundamental problems with the U.S.-Philippine relationship, a relationship the administration has publicly called superb, but which officials privately label uneasy. A clear case where the U.S. has had to come to terms with a dictator for national security reasons. The Philippines is the most important U.S. ally in Southeast Asia, the home of Subic Bay Naval Base and Clark Air Base, which officials say are vital to American strategic interests, indispensable against the growing Soviet presence in the region. But there's also growing opposition in the Philippines to Marcos and his U.S. friends. While it's generally agreed the far left is still a long way from toppling the Marcos government, the Communist Party is stepping up its activities. The U.S. is aware of this, and when Secretary of State Schultz was in Manila last spring, officials said they were trying to counter this by making contact with the moderate opposition, an effort to prepare for the time when Mr. Marcos relinquishes power. Benigno Aquino was considered the most popular moderate leader, and privately, officials call his assassination a serious loss because they believe he could have challenged both Marcos and the communists. And now many fear his assassination will radicalize the opposition even more.
So I think everyone is just astounded at this turn of events. And if it turns out to be evident that the government or some element of the government was behind it, I think the immediate reaction is going to be violence or organization of revolutionary groups and many people going to the hills and joining the New People's Army.
And if it turns out that Marcos was responsible for the assassination, officials say this would have a serious effect on U.S.-Philippine relations, including a possible cancellation of the president's trip there scheduled for November. A trip which one official said has always been one of those damned if you do and damned if you don't cases. When asked today if he still planned to go, President Reagan seemed to back off a little.
Are you going?
Well, I haven't had an opportunity to talk or know the details of this or talk with the State Department, but I'm sure that we'll be making a decision on that soon.
The State Department, meanwhile, says it's up to the president. What was an uneasy relationship apparently has become even more uncomfortable. This is Ann Garrels for Nightline at the State Department.